Morning.
It's good to see you today. Today we're going to talk about one of Satan's deadliest attacks against us, hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is an attack of Satan, and it's deadly. Hypocrisy is like taking poison into your body. It's like giving poison to other people. And so we're going to see that in Matthew chapter 16. And we're going to start at verse 5. And what's happened is Jesus has fed 4,000 people with no food. A couple of days before that, he's fed 5,000 people with no food. He created food so they could all eat, multiplied food. And now he's in the boat with his disciples. And it says in verse 5, when they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Isn't that crazy? Jesus is multiplying bread and they forget to take bread. And then Jesus says to them, be careful. Jesus said to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now when Jesus says be careful, is that something we should pay attention to? That's like should be in big letters in the Bible. Be careful. Be careful is like a parent saying, be careful when you cross the street. Be careful. Be careful. The stove is hot. Be careful. So that's like a level of warning. Be careful. But he doesn't just say be careful. He goes on to say be on your guard. Be on your guard. That to me is a higher level than just be careful. If I say be careful when you go out, there's a lot of traffic, and I add be on your guard because there's a lunatic out there with a gun, you're going to be like amping up your precautions. So he said be careful, but be on your guard. And that's because there's an enemy who's trying to sow this seed in all of us, the seed of hypocrisy. So it's very few places Jesus says, be careful, be on your guard. So this to me is like a key thing Jesus wants us to understand. Because it's such a tricky thing, this issue of hypocrisy. And we all know what hypocrisy is, right? Hypocrisy is when you pretend to be something you're not. Or you teach something and you don't apply it. It's focused on externals, not internals. So be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And then the disciples don't have a clue what he's talking about. They discuss, and by the way, Jesus has called the Pharisees hypocrisies before this, and the disciples were there. So they discussed this among themselves and said, it is because we didn't take any bread. Now, if you think about that, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they say, oh, it's because we didn't take bread with us. If Jesus is in the boat, do you need bread? You don't need bread. He can catch some fish already cooked right there. He caught a fish with money in its mouth. If you need money, he's the provider. They haven't caught that lesson, so they're still thinking on a basic level. And aware of their discussion, doesn't say he heard it, but he's aware of it. That means he knows everything. Aware of their discussion, Jesus said, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets you gathered? Or 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets you gathered? How is that you don't understand? I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So then they understood he was telling them to guard against the yeast, not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So he's not talking about bread. He's using an illustration. And what is yeast? If you ever baked something, you need yeast. And yeast is it's like tiny little grains, really small. and you mix it, and Jesus even said this in one of his parables, you mix it into the flour, and it spreads over the whole flour. It spreads. So yeast spreads, and it causes the bread to rise, or the cake to rise. So it's just, it starts little, but it expands, and it grows, and it touches every part of the loaf. So yeast of the Pharisees is like that. But what does yeast of the Pharisees mean? Another verse in Luke chapter 12, verse 1, he says, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." Hypocrisy. So hypocrisy starts small, but it'll spread throughout your life. It'll rise like yeast. That's why I used yeast as an example of hypocrisy. It won't stay small. It'll spread, grow, influence everything, puff you up. And so Jesus, back in Matthew, explains it to them. All right? Well, in Matthew 15, he's talking about the Pharisees. And he's talking about them in a situation where they're wondering why his disciples don't wash their hands, ceremonially wash their hands before they eat. An external. And Jesus calls them hypocrites. And then he says, in verse 11 of chapter 15, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles him. Then in verse 17 it says, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach, then out of the body? So they're talking about eat this, don't eat this, wash your hands a certain way. They said that's nothing. But the things that come out of a person's heart, those things defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. These are the things that defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. They were focused on looking good, but they had all these things in their hearts. Hypocrites. When we focus on the external, and our heart is not in line with the image we want to present. And that's hypocrisy. And Jesus is saying, don't live like that. Be humble. Confess. Like when he was in the temple, and the Pharisee was, thank God I'm not like other men, I'm all perfect, I'm a wonderful guy, I tithe, I do this, I don't eat pork, etc. And there's a sinner, tax collector, on his face, God help me, I'm a sinner. That one was justified, not the hypocrite. So Jesus is teaching us to beware, be on our guard, be careful against hypocrisy. It's so easy to worry about what people think and present a front. But Jesus said, of course, don't worry about what people think. All they can do is kill the body. Worry about what God thinks about you. He can not only kill the body, but he can send you to hell. And so the lesson Jesus wants us to learn is be aware of Satan's temptation to hypocrisy. We want to look good. We want to look like we got it all together. We want to look like we're Christian, when inside there's all kinds of darkness. He says, don't go that route. Be humble. Tell your needs to God and live like that. So my friends, this is a message for me and a message for you, for all of you watching. Be on your guard. Be careful against the yeast of hypocrisy. It will spread not only to you, it'll influence your life, but it spreads to other people. Because what happens when people see someone who externally is a follower of Jesus, but internally not? They say, I don't need that. I don't need that religion. So Satan not only destroys you, but your witness to people all around you. What people need to see is someone say, I'm a sinner. I failed. I need God's grace. They'll say, that's what I need too. And they'll be attracted. So my friends, again, beware, be careful of the yeast of hypocrisy. It will destroy you and it will destroy everybody around you. So we're going to pray here at Crossroads Church, as we do every Wednesday at 7 a.m. At a time of worship, we minister to God's presence. We're starting to do that. Minister to His presence. He's here. He's going to examine our hearts today. Maybe we're going to confess our sins to Him. But God is going to lead us and guide us. And I encourage you to enter God's presence and pray. Thank Him. Worship Him. Thank Him for who He is. And ask Him to examine your heart today. We're going to examine our hearts. We're going to ask Him to examine our hearts. And we're going to pray according to what He reveals to us. So God bless you. If you need a prayer, just put a comment or send me a message. We'll pray for you. God bless.